Welcome to Mental Health, It's a Trap. We're your hosts, Susan and Stephen, mother and son, unravel the complexities of the mental health traps people fall in. Join us on this podcast journey as we demystify the mental health labyrinth, explore common issues, and provide you with tools to navigate this sometimes extremely daunting terrain. You can expect engaging conversations, personal stories, and probably also have a laugh or two. Access to mental health care should not be what causes you additional stress. We invite you to follow along, and together we can embrace the darkness together.
So did you have anything, or did you think of anything that you would want to kind of talk about or add on? Or were you able to like re-listen to the episodes? Because obviously the first one was an intro, talked about Stacy, TCF. The second one, we got into more of finding a therapist and kind of navigating that.
Right.
And I think we touched on like pretty much all of like the bullet points of like what I sent you.
Yep.
And so I think I said before, like, I don't know if we want to talk about like, or if that just needs to be more thought about in terms of like the internal process of like getting help, feeling weak. Because I mean, we talked about that a little bit too in the second podcast. Yeah. Or if we just want to like talk about something different or.
I mean, I did listen to it. I should have written notes, and it's been a little crazy. I'm going to say it's been a little crazy with. Oh, when I pulled out my batch, I was done with that. But
well,
I think that.
I mean, that's a topic.
What?
Life, right? I mean, it's been 3 weeks, I think, since our last podcast, at least. And, you know, life gets in the way, and I think that's a big thing, like getting stuck in routines. And we talked about that too, again in episode 2, but like how easy it is to be comfortable and then you're stuck in your routine and you get hurt, or, you know, something bad happens, or, you know, a kid gets sick, or you're a caretaker and you're like, I was going to go see my therapist or get help or support, and then something happened, and then I never got back like into a routine or that first visit could have been helpful.
Right. Or as you say that, or that piece, I'm going to take notes too, or that piece about, you know, falling out of routine, which we could, if you wanted, we could talk about the CRS model, right?
Sure.
Which is like chaos, rigidity, and structure. And how chaos can happen in life, and talk about like the different boxes, like the different. So when I do the chaos model, I call it my CRS model, and so I use the whiteboard and I do a big circle of just craziness, and I say to people, you know, and so interestingly, it's interesting how people see different things when I put it on the whiteboard. Mm-hmm. So some people look at, so I do the scribbles, and then I do a closed-in box, and then I do another box, but I have spaces all around the box. Mm-hmm. And so that's the structure. So when I say to people, when we talk about rigid, there's nothing gets in, nothing gets out when we're too rigid. Though there are times when we need to be rigid. There is time when chaos happens. And the goal is to always get back to the structure, the flexibility of life, that things are going to happen, and how do we manage them as we go through life. So we could do that if you want. And because I tell my clients and patients one day, and I take pictures of the board, and one day I'm going to sit and look at all those pictures, and really, because it's really interesting what people see when I put those 3 things on the board and what they think it is. if they're an analytical person, it's very different responses. If they are an emotion-based person, their responses are different. So, and I think that can be helpful because I think it allows people to be able to say, like, yeah, sometimes, like, oh, someone gets a diagnosis of cancer or a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and people think it's the end of the world, when really it's not. You know what I mean? So we could do that if you want.
Yeah, I mean, we can just talk about it as we are, like, because I think that's, I don't know, even me, like, where I am right now, like, I mean, I have my associate's license and I still have to do hours if I want, like, my independent license. And even I've been thinking about, like, like really looking at what's the point of therapy, right? Like, how do you deconstruct what that looks like, as a social worker? But also like how people avoid, going to get therapy or seeing the doctor, right? Because they don't want to get a diagnosis. And like and I think that's the big thing in general, is like trying to figure out what works for you. And it comes down to that rigidity a little bit, right? Because like it's like everyone, like you have this, you go to school, you get good grades, you go to college, you go to grad school, you might get your PhD depending on your path, and that's a very structured thing, and people can be stuck in the rigidity of, I have to do these things for it to be perfect or correct, and then like something happens and it could like ruin their entire career, or because if you're not not that we're experienced in trauma and bad things, but when they talk about resilience and how a lot of people grow from adversity, which is true, but it's also a sucky thing that you have to go through that to like post-traumatic growth and all that. So I'll just stop there and see if you have any thoughts, because I know I've been in like 3 or 4 different things.
Right. So when you think about those things, right, and people have a path in life, and then all of a sudden a monkey wrench gets thrown in and it changes the path. And so if people are in this rigid box, if you will, they don't have the ability, they're in the chaos mode. So they have this perspective and this expectation of what their life is going to look like, and then that changes. And then they are in chaos. And so, yes, there are those times when things are going to happen in our lives that we don't have any control over. So it's more about, what is the control that I have of how I'm going to respond to that chaos. And, so I think a lot of that is working through the emotional state of it and then coming up with a plan for it. Mm-hmm. And I think that can be really helpful for people, though they have to recognize the emotion and then say, okay, this crazy, chaotic thing is happening in my life. What can I do about it? And it's really hard because we're emotion-based beings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, logic doesn't matter because we all understand it.
Exactly. And so you have people that are very analytical and logical, and so they repress the emotion, and then, that can be disruptive in their life at some point because they've been repressing it. And then you have the people that are so emotion-based that they struggle to tap into the logic. And It's really about a balance of the two, at least in my experience of working with people. Mm-hmm. And when people struggle with relationships and they're really having a hard time navigating them, it's about that structure piece, right? Is this relationship healthy for me? Is it toxic? You get to decide how much you're going to put into that relationship or not put anything into it. Mm-hmm. And that's the structure area where you get to choose, I'm going to give you this much space, or I'm not going to give you any space. And, when a person feels like they're in control, I think that that's really helpful.
Yeah. What was I gonna say? Yeah, because I think a part of it too is like like patterns, right? Like we get used to these patterns and they're safe, even if we're in toxic relationships or have toxic behaviors or are aggressive or loud or reactive to things. I think that's a big thing is being able to recognize when it starts, or at least when you're in it. Because I mean, if you're in it and then you're like, oh wait, I'm reacting or I'm yelling or I can feel how stressed I am in my body, let me take a break. And then, working toward, trying to recognizing it sooner. And then, if you choose to or not, right, recognizing if you want to change, because it's like, you can't make someone change, even if someone is always like, oh, you always react when I say this, or you're always yelling, or you're always picking an argument, or you're always doing these things that I don't like. And sometimes it is because of the other person's behavior that makes them react. So it could be a cycle.
Right. Though, is it really that someone's making you react, or are you allowing yourself to react?
Yeah, I'm trying to, I mean, like in ways where like, or sometimes it can be intentional. Like people do it on purpose to get reactions or to be in control. But from like a personal growth standpoint, then it is more of a like catching yourself and understanding the dynamics. And, it could get deeper. You could say guilt or shame or rejection or attachment, right? Feeling loved, and reacting to that, right? Like, because if someone leaves me, then they don't love me and I'm unlovable. And then it's like, that's not really necessarily true, even though that's like a felt sense, like it feels real to them.
Right. And probably based on experience, like life experience and what their experiences have been with others. And, I think that we often take past experiences and put them on others, which is a setup for failure at times, because that's a different individual. And they may not be that person. When I work with clients and they say, I'm never going to the doctors again because I had a really bad experience with one doctor, it's like saying, okay, so then all doctors are bad. All therapists are bad. It's really about the relationship and finding the person that you can work with.
Yeah.
And it's that all or nothing kind of thinking or catastrophic thinking of the whole world is bad. Yes, there's a lot of things that don't go well, and there are things that do go well. And I think we get stuck in those spaces. And when we can have personal growth to be able to pause, which is a big part of that CRS model, right? There's this chaos going on. I need to pause to identify what I'm feeling and identify a plan to reduce the stress that's being felt as a result of the chaos, and I think even providing examples for people, right? So chaos can be a lot of things that happen in your life: the loss of a job, the loss of a relationship, death and loss, all kinds of things. And then being able to say, okay, there's a process through those things. So we have to acknowledge that there's a process that individuals have to go through to work through it, and then get to a place where they have the ability to kind of manage it a little more effectively. And, so I think all of those things happen, and there's times when we do need to be rigid. So if someone said, hey, Susan, I need you to walk on the George Washington Bridge when people are going 80 miles an hour, I'm going to be very rigid and say, I'm not doing that. I'll get killed. I'm not doing that. So there's times when rigid does help us. It's knowing the balance between those pieces. And then again, back to that foundation of having that flexibility and structure where there's a better sense of control over how I'm responding to my environment.
Mm-hmm. And how would you, like, how do you describe structure? Like, or is that, like, if you're working with someone, or is it just kind of a framework?
I describe structure as, having a sense of control, being able to choose. So the person that I'm working with, what's going on for that person in the moment. So say it's family relationships. I have a great relationship with my brother, a so-so relationship with my sister, a great relationship with my dad, not so great with my mother because of things in the family dynamics. And then I say to them, so that flexibility structure at place allows you to set healthy boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
Because more times than not, people do want to have relationships with their family. And those are the most challenging relationships because they're family. And then there's this obligatory sense of having a relationship with family because they're family. And sometimes those relationships are really toxic.
Mm-hmm.
So can you stay in them and set those healthy boundaries to not have the toxicity impact you? Some people can do that, and some people say, no, it's just too much, and I don't want it. So they've taken that particular family member, say, and now that person's in the rigid box. And other family members might be in the chaos area or in the structure flexibility area. And they determine the space that they allow for people in their lives to have in their life. And and again, it really depends on the situation for each client. What are they bringing into the room, and what do they need help with in managing those things? Because they're all present in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does. I mean, I think families, I think everything's a nuance if you want to get technical. And especially around families, like you said, like the way that it's structured, the way that it's like power dynamics, right? You can go to that, like you have to listen to your parents. And I've heard some other people say children are to be seen and not heard. So that's a part of
Yes.
like when you grow up with that as a child, as a teen, as a young adult, if that's not like something that gets addressed or you're like, I guess, consciously aware of, because I guess in some ways you're always going to be have an awareness, even if you don't know it's there and it shows up. Because I've heard people say that, like, oh, I went to therapy, and when we went through the trauma, they were like, oh yeah, I noticed I was holding my breath a lot. And then when we talked about it and how like when I was young and I felt like, and was told to, shut up and don't say anything, that they carried it into their adulthood life and how it impacted their relationships, and how when they were able to kind of talk about it, how it felt like there was like a weight lifted off their shoulder. But I mean, obviously that doesn't make the family better, right? Like you can get better if you go to therapy or you get support, but they don't change, right? And so when you think
Right.
about where you put them in the boxes, like if they're still always going to be in the chaos box, then it, gives you that, like you said, like the structure of like having boundaries of either interacting with them or not. And that's the hard part too, right? Because again, when you come down to the family and feeling like you have to talk to your parents or, your grandparents or your elders, that, it hurts to like want to grow, but then not really, and then them not do the work. And you kind of feel like, well, what's the point sometimes?
Right. Right. And so I think it a lot of it comes down to, what do I want to have in my life? What kinds of relationships do I want to have? And we can still love someone from a distance and still set healthy limits and boundaries around what we share with others, what we don't want to share with others. And so I think that whole children are seen and not heard thing creates, I can't talk about these things. I can't feel these things. I can't share these things. Bad things happen. I have to keep them inside. And so there's all this buildup of all of this negative stuff and then suffering in silence, right? So that's a big thing that a lot of people do, particularly when they have mental health challenges with depression and anxiety and a lot of other things, is I suffer in silence because it's one of those things that, they attribute it to, I can be seen and not heard. So you can just see my exterior and you can't see the internal, right? And so there's so much that builds up in there, and people just are not aware of really what's in there on so many levels. And I think it also prohibits people from being able to set healthy boundaries and limits, because there's this sense of, I don't have that right to do that. I have to follow the norm. I have to follow what I know, and not being able to understand what lives in the subconscious, which is really the power source of how we function in our lives. And there's so much in there. And when there's not awareness and growth and understanding who we are as individuals and what makes us tick, it's important to kind of know what's in there and be able to say, is children should be seen and not heard? Is that something that I hold true? Is that something that I believe to be true? If it's not, then you get to just remove it and create something that you feel applies to you in your life.
Yeah.
And, and in working with people, and boundaries are really challenging for a lot of us. And so I just wanted to share a few memes that I had found in working with my own clients, and it really helped them to understand how relationships can be chaotic or really rigid, or how some are flexible, right? And so it just kind of brings that in. So one of the memes that I had found was, daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves, even when we risk disappointing others. And then another one is, when someone oversteps your boundaries, they're letting you know what you want doesn't matter. And then the last one is, the only people who get upset about you setting boundaries are the ones who are benefiting from you having none. And I think that that's even been helpful for me personally in my own life. And I think one of the challenges for some people is that, well, if I set boundaries, then I'm faced with conflict. And I don't want that.
Yep. Yeah, I think a part of that ties into anger, because we're not allowed to have anger, or anger is bad. And oftentimes anger is an emotion that masks other feelings. Like if you're upset, if you're frustrated, if you're grieving, if you feel betrayed, if you feel hurt, right? Oftentimes anger is like the Band-Aid or the mask emotion that shows, and oftentimes we're taught that it's bad, or if someone is angry, avoid them. And I mean, yeah, don't, you don't want to piss someone off and then be like, oh, we're friends and go hug them. But anger is healthy, and when it's repressed and not dealt with like in a healthy way that is productive or gets underneath that, it shows up in different ways and, toxic behaviors and things like that.
Right. And that's one of the biggest emotions that we were told. Don't be angry. Don't cry. Don't feel. Mm-hmm. I mean, think about those messages. They're profound messages, and the impact that it has in someone's life to say, you don't have the right to have any feelings. And that's the message that people get. And it's like, no, you have the right to have all the feelings that you have. It's what you do with them, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's what it comes down to. Yes, you can be angry. No, you can't go beat the hell out of someone because you're angry. You can't hurt others because you're angry.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the work piece, right? So I have all of these emotions, and it's even for young children in school, and they're so angry. More times than not, they're probably really anxious.
Yeah.
And so what does anger allow us to do? It allows us to keep people at a distance so that we will not be vulnerable and have to, really acknowledge what's behind that anger. Mm-hmm. Because the anger is actually easier for people.
Yeah, I think
I don't have to talk about it, and you can't get next to me.
Yeah, it's like a shield, because I think, especially when you're a kid, you don't always, but you don't, if that makes sense. Like, I feel like there's a lot of, pressure. And I mean, yeah, kids need to learn and, understand their feelings, but, they learn from adults, right? And so if something's going at home or there's a lack of support at home or they're tired and they're and they're at school and they're sleepy or they're angry or they have that one teacher and the teacher's like, oh, that one kid, they're always not paying attention or they always disrupt the class. And oftentimes it can just mean stuff's going on at home. They're not getting, love or attention or support. And the behavior is reinforced because, when I act this way, people will pay attention, but then it also keeps them, at a distance because there's that other, like you said, vulnerable, feeling underneath it.
Right. And that's a scary place for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. I don't want to be vulnerable. I don't want to be hurt again, or they just don't like the messages that they get of what's underneath there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think that's just what becomes their safe place, what they know. And then I guess, in general, no one likes change.
Nope.
If they did, it would, where would we be?
We'd be changing all the time.
Which we kind of are. When you think about it, you grow, but you still get stuck in maybe certain areas or of your life and things like that. And you can grow and you can, be a boss or CEO and, but you might be a micromanager or you might be hard, militant where, a lot of the shift is going to be being more positive reinforcement at work or supportive versus do your job or you're fired or strict ways. And right. There's that balance.
Yeah, it's really tough. It's not easy. Not easy navigating being a human being.
Nope, it's messy. Got to figure out a lot of stuff.
Yeah, it's all right, fit in this box. Have fun with that. So I participated in a study today from a student from Cornell, PhD student, and it was really interesting. And it was fun to actually be able to provide some clinical feedback, though also. So it was about telehealth and so telehealth and graphs. How to when we fill out the depression and anxiety scales, and so we get these numbers, and if someone does it once a month or every other week, we get to collect data from that and analyze the data. And so it was really interesting how I could have an idea of where a patient might be based on self-report of some of the areas on those scales and graphing it out. And then other parts that they looked at. And so it was just really interesting. And I had to have a perspective shift in that. So a change, right? Mm-hmm. Change in what I know that I do in my job as a therapist, and then looking at data on this graph and how it gets impacted by other things. So I'm really interested to see what the results of that study will be. And again, it's that change, and it was pretty evident, and I noticed it, and the person that I was on the call, on the video chat with doing this, noticed it as well. And we talked about it, which was nice. It gave us an opportunity. It gave me an opportunity to say, oh, so I could be looking at things a little more differently based on other information. So having more information is better than just a sliver or a piece of pie, if you will, to say, oh, well, your depression scale was a 21, and that's that snapshot in time, right? Mm-hmm. Not necessarily that whole thing. And so it was really interesting. So it kind of helped me to kind of shift my perspective a little bit to say, which falls into this whole box thing, right? Of let's put people in boxes, and this is the norm, and this is how we expect you to be. And that doesn't work for everyone.
No.
You know, therapy styles. One of my patients said to me today, so I talked to my hairdresser, and I tell her that I see you. And I told her that the first time I met with you, you said, I'm not here to fix you. And I said, I'm not here to fix you. I'm here to help you figure out how to help yourself. And her hairdresser said, you need a new therapist.
That's interesting.
That is interesting. I laughed. I said, well, that is your choice if you'd like to find another therapist. And she's like, no, that was her perspective. I go, okay. And at the end of the day, we're just, the hope is to help people find ways to live their best self.
Mm-hmm. And I think that goes a little deeper, like, in general, like no one wants to be fixed, right? Because it's not, no one wants to be broken in a way, right? Like the things we go to, and people can say that. I mean, people say that, will say that. They'll be like, oh, I'm so broken, I need to be fixed. And it's like kind of what I was saying earlier about like thinking about like what is therapy, like when, like you said, it's about the relationship, so it's not a good fit. So sometimes it's the therapist, sometimes it's the technique, right? Because not all therapists are trained the same way or in the same modality. There's so many out there, and people are coming up with like newer ones because it works for certain people, which is great, right? Because there's nothing out there for anything that's a one size fits all, whether it's mental health or medical or physical or wellness, right? Everyone does things differently, whether it's breath work, yoga, running, exercise, being a couch potato, like doing nothing, being against everything, right? And so trying to figure out like, what works best for you. And then also like trying new things. Cause like, even though you might be against something, like, and again, it comes down to change. Like people don't want to change. So oftentimes they don't want to try something new, but it's like, what's it going to do if you just try it? Like, like kind of like support groups. If you try something for, go to a yoga group for 3 times to see like if you like it or if it's helpful, get out of your box and, get out of your rigidity and, and grow a little bit.
Right. Because you can't grow when rigid.
Yeah. Well, I hope that everyone has found some value in our chit chat today. And of course, again, I always say if there's any feedback, comments, questions, or if you want us to go to more in depth about a topic, or maybe we can in the future provide like a little video example of what the CRS model looks like, because I think visually sometimes things like that can be helpful. And those are some of the things that we're thinking about as we grow as a podcast. So we appreciate you listening, and take care.
Thank you.